Aikido or whatever, a lot of these techniques were also weapon retention techniques that come from, all right, so we do a lot of, in Aikido, if someone grabs our wrist. Okay, well, how often in the West do people grab our wrist to attack us? Maybe grab us to pull us in and smack us with the other hand or something like that, right? But you're going to come up, you're going to tackle us or grab us and pull or whatever. Most people don't just grab your wrist and stand there. That's not how, right, that works very often in the West. It's not a very common attack, we would say, right? Well, keep in mind, if I had my sword on my right hip and I started to draw it, if you didn't want to get cut, what would you do? You'd keep me from drawing my sword, wouldn't you? So you'd grab my wrist so I couldn't pull it. Oh. Right? So this is where a lot of our joint locks that we have today were weapon retention techniques. Some of the grappling, right, is weapon retention. Same idea. That we close so they can't get a hold of we're keeping them from drawing their weapons, their long sword, short sword, dirk, whatever, right? We're tying up to keep them from grabbing things and hopefully throwing them down or whatever else, right? So some of the techniques we have today harken back to the older version of jiu-jitsu as well, okay? But yeah, you have joint locks, whatever, okay? A lot of times there's also resuscitation techniques or healing techniques as well. And now, given the number of schools and everything else, different schools specialize in different types of techniques, maybe different secondary weapons and things like that, right? So again, it's kind of hard to say to make broad sweeping strokes about all styles of jiu-jitsu, because there's a lot of variance in that, but still. Ju means pliable, okay, or yielding, sometimes referred to as gentle, okay? So, sorry. Or, right, as in jiu-jitsu today is spelled that way, like Brazilian jiu-jitsu, right, it's spelled that way, right? But, Ju is gentle or pliable, okay? So, jiu-jitsu is sometimes referred to as the gentle art. But you look at it and you're like, that doesn't look very gentle. There's, right, that's, slamming people to the ground, twisting on limbs, things like that. That doesn't seem very gentle to me, okay? So gentle may be a little bit of a mistranslation. The analogy comes from kind of the snow on the branch, right? So did we talk about this? We talked about Tai Chi, I can't remember, right? I kind of use in Tai Chi too. So like if you have a bunch of, this is a very classic jiu-jitsu metaphor, right? So if you have a lot of, like you have a winter storm or something like that, you have a lot of snow, a lot of ice, you might have a really strong tree like an oak or something like that that's a hardwood, right? It'll stand up to a lot, but eventually the amount of ice, eventually some branches will snap under the weight, okay? Versus like the willow tree that is soft and supple, right? And the snow starts to accumulate, it starts to bend and push the willow tree down. Well, eventually the willow tree, it'll bend so much that the snow and ice will slough off, and then it will come back to shape, and it's not broken. That is the metaphor, the idea behind jiu-jitsu, right? And actually, the part that people don't appreciate is when it snaps back. It kind of snaps back violently, right? It doesn't just slowly come back up. It releases and comes back with some force, some energy there, right? So the idea is it's not so much, again, gentle as in soft. It's pliable, it's yielding, it's finding the opening, the weakness in the opponent's guard, using their, using their energy against them in some ways and things like that, right? So it kind of goes, kind of harkens back to that day and time, or that concept of, again, using the person against the energy against them and stuff like that, okay? One particular style of jiu-jitsu you hear a lot about today is Daido-ryu Eiki Jiu-Jitsu. That's a word. Get that in Scrabble, right? Daido-ryu Eiki Jiu-Jitsu. And the reason that one is of importance is because arguably both Hapkido and Aikido, were greatly influenced, arguably were born out of these systems, okay? And so, even so, a lot of times, even like practitioners of those arts, Aikido and Aikido, like, oh, well, I want to learn kind of the parent art, I want to learn where it came from or whatever. So it's kind of enjoying a bit of a resurgence because of its original, or because of the arts that it spawned, okay? And so it has stayed important in that regard. The last, we'll talk more about Takeda in the next class when we talk about Hapkido and Aikido a little bit more, okay? Now, so that's a little bit about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Now let's talk about Gracie Jiu-Jitsu or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Originally, it was the same, Gracie and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu back in the day was the same thing. Now the art has spread so much far beyond the Gracie family that it's really more just Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, or the acronym BJJ, which most everybody uses today, okay? But it was founded by the Gracie family in Brazil. The Gracies were actually from Scotland. They moved to Brazil in 1801. In 1914, Maeda, who was a judo/jiu-jitsu master who traveled, remember when we were talking about that amusement hall era in wrestling last week, when again they would go from place to place and would travel around and take on champions and do exhibitions and stuff like that. Well, Count Coma was a wrestler, jiu-jitsu guy who would do that. He actually toured America as well, as I understand, but ended up in Brazil, and again was a jiu-jitsu/judo famous jiu-jitsu champion who taught Carlos Gracie jiu-jitsu, okay? Carlos and his 4 brothers were the first to open jiu-jitsu academies in Brazil, okay? Among them was the youngest and the smallest was a guy by the name of Elio. And depending on who you ask, largely depending on who you learn from, right? And so who's more important to you. But a lot of people would argue that Elio was really, in some ways, the true founder of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu because he was smaller, a lot smaller, and supposedly modified some of the techniques that relied a little more on strength or things like that. And so again, when did it stop becoming Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, and when did it start becoming Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? Where did that shift happen, right? What was the difference there, okay? And so some people would argue that again, depends on who you fall under. If you didn't learn from Elio as much, then you would probably not argue this as much, okay? Elio was considered the best tactician because he had to find a way to kind of modify or work more efficiently because he was the smaller of the group, right? And so the legend has it like one of the times, like his older brother, who's the main guy, Carlos, was late to a private lesson with a pretty influential guy or whatever, and you know, and Haley was like, well, my brother's running late, but I can teach you in the meantime since you're here and everything. And then when we got done, like the guy's like, no, I want Halo to teach me from now on, right? Because again, it was, you know, again, more refined or whatever else. So that as legend has or whatever. But Haleo developed, again, added new techniques or refined the techniques, I should say. Was kind of a jiu-jitsu champion for Brazil for a long time. In 1950, Haleo challenged the heavyweight jiu-jitsu champ, and he basically defeated another judo/jiu-jitsu guy to win that chance. Now the champ was by the guy by the name of Kimura, okay? I will give you the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu version of that match first. Kimura weighed 80 pounds more than Haleo. If Kimura was like something like 210, 220, or whatever else, Haleo was something around 140, right? To give you means of comparison, someone bigger than me versus Mr. Yoshida, right? Those of you guys who do classes here kind of know what I mean by that. So pretty big size difference. Kimura himself supposedly said that if Gracie lasted 3 minutes with him, Gracie should be considered the winner. Okay? Haleo did lose, but it took 13 minutes, and it kind of impressed the champ so much that again he went to, you know, basically that was considered very much a moral victory. Okay. So that is the account that the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu people will tell as far as the history of Jiu-Jitsu and stuff. Kimura does not get credit for being one of the greatest grapplers of all time. He tore through everybody in judo. Like when he was something like 40 years old, like he just walked into the judo Olympic team and like basically tore through the entire team, like one right after another, every size, every weight class, and just, you know, at an older age, and just like, you know, basically if you wanted to, you could add any of their spots, right, or whatever. Again, was a dominant figure in jiu-jitsu or judo for a long time, okay? So the footage a lot of times you see is the good parts of the match or whatever. Like there are other accounts that basically Kimura on the ground basically nearly suffocated Haleo. Like Haleo might have lost consciousness at one point in the fight. He might have put him in a headlock so tight his ears started to bleed, right? So in those 13 minutes, like Kimura almost killed Haleo a couple of times, right? And then was nice enough to let go and let the match continue, right? So again, it's very different accounts between what went on or whatever else, okay? But anyway, it was overall, but again, keep in mind, again, it was like an 80-pound weight difference in a sport that divides weight pretty evenly for the sport, okay? Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu came to America in the 80s. And then, of course, there is the UFC, which was largely now it is a sport in and of itself, MMA, and of course, UFC is sometimes, shouldn't be, but is sometimes almost synonymous at UFC at the upper echelon levels. But it was originally, the UFC was a Gracie thing. The Gracie started the UFC to showcase the effectiveness of their martial art against other styles of martial arts. They very much handpicked or cherry-picked who they were fighting in these matches, though. The early matches, they were martial artists, but they were not, you know, again, Haleo Gracie fought Van who had like something like 10 black belts or whatever. I mean, he was well versed in martial arts. He was also like 50 years old, right? They were very selective, and they weren't taking on like the world heavyweight boxing champion or whatever. Now, admittedly, the boxing champion wouldn't give them much credit, right? So one of the key things about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or Gracie Jiu-Jitsu the UFC did was it absolutely did do this. It re-emphasized or really in some ways reintroduced people to the grappling arts as a viable martial art. When people thought about fighting and what real martial arts was, it was kung fu, it was kicking, it was punching. Wrestling was a sport, it wasn't martial arts. It wasn't a way for self-defense. If you wanted to learn, you boxed, you kickboxed, you kicked, you did kung fu, you did something else. Grappling was not it was not self-defense at all, okay? It was just a sport you did in high school. Yes, there was judo, it was just another sport, okay? To the mainstream, okay? Now, if you're a judo guy, then yeah, you kind of knew, right, or whatever else. But I will be the first to admit, too, that my grappling was a very understated aspect. I was doing a lot of different martial arts at the time, even back when the UFC first came out. Right? I watched, these early UFC matches firsthand or whatever else, too, right? But it was really the UFC and Gracie Jiu-Jitsu that and now when you watch UFC or do MMA, I mean, grappling is a major component of it, right? Wrestling, not just Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but wrestling, or other types of standing grappling and takedowns and things like that, and then the ground submission game, and then you have your fight, and then you have your striking, okay? Now, nowadays, while just like any other sport, you have people that specialize in certain things, right? You have football teams that are better running the ball or passing the ball. You have different quarterbacks that are better at scrambling or better pocket passers. I mean, everybody has strengths and weaknesses. So in the UFC, again, you have strikers and you still have people who focus more on striking versus grappling. But buddy, you better have a little bit of something. It isn't just a random Taekwondo guy versus a random wrestler or whatever else. These are professional athletes who focus on a well-rounded MMA game, right? So the premise that the UFC has evolved into a sport in and of itself, not necessarily, again, or it goes beyond what the original intent was, which was to, again, pit style versus style, who has the best style or whatever, okay? But, like I said, the Gracies, engineered their success a little bit, but at the same time, it very, and rightly so, re-emphasized grappling as a part of self-defense and overall martial arts effectiveness. Okay. Now, the one thing that Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and it is now Gracie Jiu-Jitsu or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a sport into itself now, or submission grappling is kind of now a sport and arguably one of the fastest growing sports in the world, right? So it's a sport in and of its own right nowadays. But what makes Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu different than judo or Japanese Jiu-Jitsu and things like that? And really is its emphasis on the ground, okay? And yes, you have to have takedowns or whatever else, right? And judo has groundwork, but the idea of judo is if you get a pin, if you hold someone down on the ground for 30 seconds, you automatically win. Okay? So in wrestling, if you expose their back, if you get a fall, if their back lands on the mat, it's a pin, you win. Okay? Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, perhaps more than anything, focuses on, well, it doesn't exclusively focus on, but one thing that's very unique about it is actually working on its back. Okay? So, pins are an artificial sport thing, right? A lot of offense in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is on your back on the ground, whereas most other grappling arts, you get there, the match is over, you lost. In Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you're still considered to have the dominant position if they're inside your guard, right? Because you can work things from the guard to attack, to sweep, to throw the other guy, etc. Okay? If I shove you on your keister and I jump on top of you, you're on your back. You better learn how to fight from there. Okay? And submit, sweep, change positions, whatever else, right? So that's one of the big things about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, okay? A lot of times you hear talk about boa constrictor tightness and things like that, where the idea with a boa constrictor is I exhale, it tightens up. Now I can't inhale, I can't take that, I don't get that space back. I exhale some more, it takes some more, right? And it just keeps squeezing, squeezing, squeezing. It slowly keeps readjusting. In a lot of ways, that's a good metaphor for a lot of jiu-jitsu. It's about being tight and having a lot of pressure and tightness, and they move and they take you away and they take you away and they take it away until you're in a worse and worse position, until you are not, you really can't do, then they can get the submission and you can't do very much about it, right? So a lot of ways that's a very good analogy for how jiu-jitsu works in a lot of times, okay? Of course, the emphasis is on submission, well, positional dominance, but then also submissions, the chokes, the arm bars of judo, but are usually a little more varied, okay? The other thing that is important to note about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in particular is the game has, or the style has evolved actually really, really fast. Part because of the sport, right? Like any other sport, it's like, well, I got to come up with a new play that no one has seen before, an offense that no one has seen before, because they won't know how to stop it. And I can, and so there's that innovation in the sport, trying to, what works, everybody figures everything else out. Now I got to come up with something new that no one has figured out yet. So there is, in any sport, there is that emphasis. And that's, as we've talked about before, Brazil, or a lot of the Japanese arts, the idea or the imagery that we are, doing what was happened thousands of years ago or hundreds of years ago and has been handed down, that's just, for a lot of reasons it didn't happen. It's not like that. However, Japanese society is much more conservative. It is much more, you learn, you imitate before you're allowed to create. It's much more rigid, okay? Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilians, man, they like to surf. They like to have a good time. It's a very different energy, right, than, Rio de Janeiro has a very different vibe than Tokyo, right? And so, in some ways, like the innovation that has come out of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in terms of technique on the ground and stuff like that, really had to happen elsewhere other than Japan. Like Japan would just not allow, when you hear Brazilians, they talk about playing Jiu-Jitsu, right? That, Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, that you're serious, you're training. Brazilian, well, let's play around, let's see what happens, right? It's more laid back, it fosters a more creative environment, right? And as such, you get some pretty weird stuff that comes out of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, okay? Is it martially sound? Is it part of its martial roots? No, that's another question, right? So you have these weird spider guards, or, well, that's not even all that weird. There's a lot of different types of techniques, and someone will all of a sudden come up with something kind of new and make news in the sport, because everybody's like, what is he doing? I've never, kind of pulling off some surprising victories and catching people like, I don't know what that was, and people, and then everybody has to go back and study it and then figure out how they're going to shut it down and defeat it, right? And so there's a lot more lab work going on, but in the modern day sport of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. One other thing that's interesting to note, that is worth noting about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, is its rank is very different than other martial arts, right? Old school Jiu-Jitsu, like we talked about last week, and even a lot of Jiu-Jitsu schools today still don't necessarily follow the ranking system that Kano developed, the belt rank system, but we talked about the licensing system, right? The Minkyo, the Shihans, the various Soke, Grandmaster, these various titles that kind of were degrees of certificate, right? Graduation certificates. You graduated grade school, you graduated middle school, you graduated high school, college, you got a master's degree, you got a PhD, right? Some of that, again, some of it is very more specific certifications, right? I got certified in this computer programming system, right? Or whatever, like in IT, you hear that, get certified in whatever is the new computer language or whatever. Back in my day it was DOS, that's probably COBOL. I don't think those even exist anymore, but you get the idea, right? So now, or whatever. So you have more specific, so there might be much more specific, but the certification system was very different, or that's the best analogy I have for it, okay, for that, okay? Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, even still today, sometimes you get some of that, okay? But Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu does have a stripes, or does have a belt system, but it is very different than, usually, as we said, there are 10 belt colors, okay, or 10 belt ranks. Sometimes we just use stripes and have fewer colors in their belt system, but we use the stripes to separate, okay? In Jiu-Jitsu, in the adult ranks, it goes, well, you can see it on the wall next door, right? It goes white, blue, purple, brown, and then black, okay, are the ranks of Jiu-Jitsu. And then even newer now is then back in the day when I got like my blue belt, there were no stripes on the belts or whatever, but I'm old, right? So now you get like basically 4 stripes per belt. So you'll see, right, those of you guys in class, you see the Jiu-Jitsu guys, then there are stripes on the belts, on the field on their belts, right? So you get 4 stripes before you move on to the next belt or whatever else. But it's a very different rank system, and it takes much longer. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belts, people say 10 to 12 years, okay? So some longer, some shorter. Other people got it significantly less, but that's if they're living in Jiu-Jitsu and basically training full-time, like professionally, like 8 hours a day type Jiu-Jitsu, right? But again, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it has a very different ranking system. A black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is literally, you've spent more time working on that than people have on their PhDs, right? Their medical degree, okay? Now, a black belt in Taekwondo is still an accomplishment or something like that, but it is not the same, right? The degree of black belt. A black belt in Taekwondo is like really being like a high blue belt in Jiu-Jitsu, right? So again, the belt system, it takes a lot longer per belt. Again, the competency goes up and stuff like that. So, so whether you do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or not, you need to appreciate that about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, right? Because again, the ranks are, oh, he's got a purple belt, I got a purple belt. No, that's a very different purple belt, right? And back, you don't see it as much anymore, but back when the Gracies first came on the scene, and this is incredibly arrogant if you ask me anyway, like, even like a lot of times, if I'm learning someplace new, I might put on a white belt if it's if I don't, like, I might have a black belt in Aikido, but when I went to the KHF instructor training course, I I wasn't a black belt with them, right? I didn't have any rank with them. I didn't know what they were doing, right? So I put on white belt. I don't have your rank, okay? And they're like, so after a while, they're like, okay, you're not a white belt. What's your rank? I'm like, go put your white belt. I'm like, okay, yes, sir, right? Or whatever. But, that wasn't me to presume or whatever. Back in the day, early days when Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was happening or whatever, right? People, I can remember going to Jiu-Jitsu seminars and people were walking in with, their whatever other black belt on. I'm like, you are not a black belt. Like it was new to the United States. I'm like the highest practitioners that were American were like blue belts, right? And this guy, I'm like, you're not really a black belt. You don't understand what this black belt means. That black belt is not your black belt, right? Type thing. So, again, you should appreciate that. Okay? All right, let's go next door and do some stuff.